I just hadn't seen Kim in a couple of years since she retired and moved out here. So
Yep.
and this was on my list, and we're like, let's meet up and do this. Okay.
And there you are.
Yeah.
So we're on the podcast. We're starting now. And, you know, I love this when people walk in that are important people like both of you. You came to see the new Maynard Dixon Museum, and I wasn't even in. And they called and said, hey, we got some Lummis curator and archivist. And I'm like, ooh, yes, I want to talk to them, but they'll have me. So it's kind of one of those impromptu events. We've got Kim Walters, who was the archivist. She's now retired. And Christian Rodriguez, who is the current curator of the Lummis House, Alisal. And so we're going to kind of have a back and forth banner of that. Maybe I'll just get a little background on both of you just so I can have a sense of your history. So maybe Kim, you could tell me just a little about yourself.
Sure. I worked at originally the Southwest Museum, and I was the director of the Braun Research Library.
Oh, very cool.
Over the Lummis archives and all the other material. And I continued working there once we merged with Autry. I was there for 24 years with them. Then I did some consultation, and then I worked at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County in the Seavers Center of Western History, and I did archival research for them.
And what year did you start working with the Southwest Museum?
1990.
1990. Yeah, I was just leaving. I was in LA as a military physician, and because I used to go there to the Southwest Museum. I mean, it was just used to blow my mind.
That's amazing.
And
yeah. And just for context, we should say for I guess people watching, right? That's Charles Lummis was the founder of the Southwest Museum.
That's
and
exactly.
the Southwest
1907,
Museum.
Right?
1907 was founded in 1907. The building that it is housed in was built in 1914. But the museum was founded, and it's the first museum in Los Angeles.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. They like to, because there's always this debate between the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County and Lummis Home, which was first, but Lummis incorporated the museum in December 1907 with the state of California. So it beat out.
Yes, because the county museum in Los Angeles was built in 1913. So it's a year older building.
Yeah.
So if we want to get
that's
technical.
just the time Dixon is leaving for New York City, is in 1907, and he's having lots of conversations with Lummis at that time as well about it and writing about, you know, Lummis is telling him, and you may know, do you know these stories? Maybe not.
Yeah.
So, you know, he's telling Dixon, don't let them eat you alive. Don't let them change you, because they can do it. And if they do, get back here. Yeah, he was very leery, I think, of New York City.
Interesting.
Really. And probably the East Coast in general.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Well,
I don't know what his feelings were about Harvard.
But strong. I think he is. My take on Lummis has always been that part of his transforming himself into this sort of ultimate Southwesterner persona that he had fashioned for himself was explicitly eschewing everything that was New England or Eastern. You know,
ridding
himself
because
of that.
He actually start the term Southwest.
That's what I've
read too.
I've
never
I've seen it debated with other people.
Like, it's one of those things that the problem with Lummis is that there's a lot of lore about. First off, Lummis, like I already alluded to, was the creator of his own life narrative, right? He had his own persona.
Yeah.
But so there's a lot of things that are attached to Lummis that see America first. Do we know that is true?
That is true.
That is true.
Sure.
Okay. Tell us about that.
He coined the slogan "See America First"
for the railroads.
Okay. But there's a couple other things I'm blanking on right now. But things like that have been oft repeated, and but a lot of it is Lummis was so adept at creating this persona that even in his own life, you know, people started to sort of treat him as though he was like a cultural relic. And then once he passes away, the lore kind of built, and then somebody says something and it gets repeated to the point that you're like, oh wait, but did Lummis ever claim that in his lifetime? You know, it was.
He
very
seems like
adept
the
at
kind of guy who would claim a lot.
Yes.
You know, if I'm not mistaken on how I read this.
Absolutely.
Right.
And we should say, let's hear a little bit about you since we've jumped over it for Christian. Yeah.
So I've been at Alisal now for 12 years.
Oh wow.
I've been the guy in charge for 9. This is Department of Recreation and Parks for the City of Los Angeles.
Because they own it, right?
They own it and they operate it as a
Do they
museum.
want to own it? That's a hard question. You don't have to answer.
I think they are operating the house as a museum, and that's what I do for them.
Yeah, because it takes a lot of funds. It's an old house. There's a lot of things that have to be at code and all that, right?
Well, and that's what we're sort of attacking right now, because the El Alisal has never been subject to a top-to-bottom restoration. It's in remarkable condition, given that because it was always intended to become a museum. Only Lummis's family lived there, and then it became a museum. So,
and did it become a museum about the time that the Southwest Museum closed? No, it was a museum before that. Yeah.
Long before.
Because I'm thinking I went to that when I went to both of them.
Yes. No,
And upon Lummis's death, it was turned over to the Southwest Museum.
correct. Yeah.
And-
100
and
years
then
ago this year is the
yeah.
institutional history of the house as a museum.
And the museum, Southwest Museum, operated it. And then because of the Depression and all their funding issues, they realized that they couldn't operate it. And there was a separate I'm not quite sure if that's the right term, Save Alisal Foundation. And then eventually in the early 40s, I want to say like 42, the Southwest Museum turned it over to the state of
They
California.
actually sold it to the state of California.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, they sold it for
Yeah.
$10,000 or something
Yeah.
like that. And shortly after is when it became a state historic landmark. And like I said, the Southwest Museum operated it, but that's very generous
Yeah.
because I think at the time, really what happened was Lummis passes away, like I said, 100 years ago this year.
Well, he dies November 25th, 1928, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So in 1924, when he was still alive and
Right.
living at El Alisal, he had set in motion for it to become a museum. It's kind of a longish story, but basically he had mortgaged a house when it was about to lose it. He was not doing well. These debts were
Yeah.
being called in. And
That happened a few times in his career.
Yes.
yes. In this instance, I believe some friends, I forget specifically, but there was a
Lunns.
group. Was it the Lunns
The
specifically?
Lunns, they were
Yeah.
next door neighbors. Correct?
Oh, I don't remember because I get the instances confused. But he had some friends that bailed him out, basically. But then that started the ball of like, he had left the Southwest Museum. He was
Right.
no longer affiliated with them, but they kind of went back to them and said, well, are you interested in taking over this property and his collections as a museum and having it be a part of the Southwest Museum, which Southwest Museum is right up the hill from
Right.
from his house. So I think at the time they kind of bit and it made sense.
Right.
And so the Southwest Museum, then he worked out this great arrangement with them where he got to live there until he passed away. He had the right to live there. He didn't own that. They paid for the house, or they paid off whatever had been covered by
Right.
the friends. And
I think that's when they made him curator emeritus. And
emeritus,
I
which
think
meant
they
he
paid him.
didn't really mean anything,
Right.
but it was just a nice thing.
I
They
think
give a
they gave him
certificate.
a
stipend,
stipend,
yeah.
yeah.
It was like
For
$100 a month.
For the house or
For
for
him.
the
To
whole
live.
thing? Yeah.
That's what he lived off of. That was effectively his retirement, $100 a month
I
or
think so.
something
But he
like
had
that.
all that wonderful material that he owned. I assume it was all went with the Southwest Museum. It was
Most of
his, right? I mean,
Most
Yeah.
of it,
Yeah.
yes. The vast majority of it is the material that is his collection at the Southwest Museum. We have a lot of original material
The
that
Autry.
still is which is now the Autry, correct?
Right.
In 2003, the Southwest Museum
Yes.
merged with the Gene Autry Museum of Western Heritage, and the
Right.
resulting museum is the Autry. Today, the Autry Museum of the American West. But it's in that collection today. We have original material at the house. We don't have a lot we don't really have explicit provenance. A lot of it is just presumed to be material the family kept, because there are a lot of family photos, personal things of that sort. But all of his indigenous artifacts, and certainly his Spanish colonial books and all that stuff that has tremendous research value, his personal papers, is all in the collections of the Autry today.
at the Autry.
Yeah.
And do you know if researchers want to get in there,
yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of the material, the actual objects, are down in a storage unit, not at the Autry.
Well, the Autry
That's
has
where
a
the library collection is.
Yeah.
as
Correct,
well.
yeah.
Because I've seen that. I've been there.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are open now. It's called the Autry Resource Center, and it's a building that they've remodeled, and it's
Yes.
really state of the art, and they have
Yeah.
all their museum collections. So effectively, the Autry today they have their galleries, which is in Griffith Park across from
Right.
the LA Zoo, and then they have this off-site facility, which is where the research libraries are,
Right.
and the collection
Right.
storage is. Yeah.
I've seen the storage. It's hard to see it all because a lot of it's covered up with
Mm-hmm.
different things, like all the textiles are covered, a lot of the pots are covered,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that.
They have beautiful mounts for their saddles. Did you see
I
that?
saw this.
Yeah.
they're to die for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're custom mounts.
Yeah.
And were those from the Southwest? No.
Most of them were the Autry collection. There are a few saddles that the Southwest had, but no, they were the Autrys. Most of the Autry saddles, but they're gorgeous.
Yeah, the collections are combined now in that
Yeah,
facility.
and what year did that take place?
2003.
2003, yeah.
When the merger happened.
Right.
Yeah.
And they purchased the building that they renovated into the collection storage in 2010.
Yeah.
And then
It's been
I mean, it's a
years
state of the
remodeling.
art.
many
Oh, it's really
years.
nice.
It's
Yeah.
a beautiful.
It's been many years remodeling it, and I think it really, because I've started doing research there a couple of years ago, so it's been open a couple of years for researchers at this point. Yeah,
Yeah,
And
just apply. There's an application online.
Yeah.
You just apply.
I'd like it.
And also you can go to the Lummis House and do research as well?
So not really. We do have a collection there, an
Yeah.
archive, but we're very minimally staffed. So we don't have. We're working on trying to. Again, our collection is really small, although it's not insignificant. We have about 5,000 individual items, but a big chunk of it is not actually Lummis material explicitly. A lot of it has to do with the institutional history of the house as a museum. So files relating to the house operating as a museum, or the newsletters of the organizations that ran the house over the years, things like that. As far as original Lummis material, we have very, very little that is not represented in the Autry's collection. So nevertheless, we're still working on trying to confirm that, because that's to the best of our knowledge, but we might have material in there that is not duplicated in the Autry's collection, so we want to make sure, obviously, if that is the case, to make it available to researchers and to the public. So my pie in the sky, which again we're inching towards, again with small museums, it's always a dilemma. It's you never have the funding, you need to do this kind of stuff, but what we're slowly inching towards is, my hope will be that we digitize the majority of our collection
that was
to make
my
it
question,
to make it available in that way, because as a small museum open to the public on weekends, we just don't have the capacity to have researchers.
And it's
come
only
in.
open on the weekends?
We're only open on weekends right now. It's good. We hope to be open more hours soon, but right now it's a Saturday and Sunday 10 to 3.
And if they came Saturday to Sunday, they would be able to see his home, things in his home that related to, like, I mean, is there his bedroom and that kind of thing that you can see?
So,
or is it?
Yes, so you can go, so the main rooms of the house are open, which was the Zaguan, which was the entry hall to the house, the Museo, which was his main living space, but he called it Museo because that's where he displayed it. He wanted to show off all his
this good
collections.
stuff, right.
The dining room and kitchen, when we have one bedroom off of the main hall that is available for viewing, because we don't have any off-site storage, the rest of the house is actually
Storage.
Well, one bedroom is storage for the collections. The second level is not accessible to the public, but we don't store anything up there, but we do have a video tour so people can see what it looks like.
Yeah, so it's kind of a snapshot of his house when he died in 1925. Would that be
28.
true to say?
1928.
I mean 28.
Yeah, he it's not exactly, because we don't have it exactly furnished as he did, right? And it's not see, the interesting thing about that house as a museum is that when they first fought to preserve the house as a museum, there's a big preservation battle to fight to have it turned into a museum, when the Southwest Museum deduced that they didn't want to operate it as a museum anymore. At that time, echoing what I just said earlier, at that time the emphasis was Lummis and his legacy, right? That's what they were interpreting. And so the building was just thought of as like, well, this is a kooky byproduct of Lummis's life and a functional space where we can interpret Lummis. And they had a few other ideas too initially. What's interesting about that building is that house as a museum is that it was not an old house when they fought to preserve it. It was a 30-year-old house when Lummis died. And it's fascinating because people always talk about preservation in Los Angeles and how there's no preservation in Los Angeles. And it's like, but this is a shining example of people in the community fought to preserve this house as a museum before, when it was a 30-year-old house.
Right. And his son's ashes are in that.
Lummis
And
Lummis's
as well.
And
both of them.
And two other children and a daughter-in-law. There's 5 people buried there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Into the building itself, I know, right? As far
Lummis
as
and his son.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So at any rate, but when they fought to preserve it, they saw it more as a functional space. So there have been alterations. As I said, the house has never been subject to a top-to-bottom restoration. It's at the juncture now where it needs one. It's all original plus what's been altered. So all of that was to say that when we don't have, the house is not like a living history museum,
Right.
or like a coded in amber time machine. In fact, it's self-guided. You walk in, we allow people to wander. It's not like a stay on the velvet rope where the
Right.
house is, and that's a big part of it, is because most of Lummis's collections that were there originally are in the Autry.
Right.
So what we have are the original artifacts that we do have, which are some of which is on display, and we have a lot of other exhibits that relate to Lummis and the history of the house that are not necessarily. So it's a kind of hybrid house museum and
Got it.
regular museum, right?
Yeah.
It's not like again, not the classic historic house museum where it's like a time machine and it looks like
Right.
it did when Lummis lived there.
Like mine.
Well, and a part of that too, also again, because they didn't see the value at that time, presumably, of keeping like bedroom furniture. No one's
Right.
going to sleep here anymore.
Right.
So they kind of, as far as we're aware, that stuff doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And so the rooms that were the bedrooms were office spaces for
Yeah.
many years, and they, like it's the one still
Yeah.
continues to be.
And the Southwest Museum is now closed, correct?
The
Correct.
building is
The
closed.
building
Yes.
is closed.
And because it needs major work too. It's
Yes.
right.
Yes,
It's
yes. It's a 110-year-old cement building on the side of a hill in Los Angeles.
Right.
And with all of the, issues relating to that, especially when you're trying to have a modern museum space, that's very difficult.
Yeah. What's going to happen with that?
And it's not really handicapped accessible.
Well, yeah,
which
that's
was
right.
always an
Accessibility, there's
issue.
lots of issues
And
there.
stairs and all that
Yes,
stuff.
yeah.
And it needs what, 10 million or something to be redone or more, maybe.
Probably
Somewhere in that
probably
area,
more
definitely,
now.
probably
but-
I
more
mean,
now.
it's
Yeah,
such a beautiful building with
it's
the
an amazing building.
things
Yeah.
in there, but it's kind of a noose around the city, isn't it? In a weird way.
Well,
Well,
it
it's
belongs
not
to the
city, it
museum.
belongs to the Autry.
Autry.
Yeah,
A
it belongs to the
noose
museum.
around their neck. Then, I
Yeah.
guess, in a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, so they're trying to come up. For years, they were working with the National Trust for Historic Preservation to try to come up with some sort of adaptive reuse plan
Yeah,
for
it's a
it.
great house.
It's an amazing
Museum,
building,
whatever,
and designed by Sumner Hunt. It's
Yeah.
a beautiful building, but yeah, it is there an albatross for them, because I think that they have to identify some sort of use for it,
Right.
and somebody who wants that specific site with all of the challenges
Right.
it comes with, and what do you want it to be? And I think the museum has made an effort to try to make it
Right.
be some sort of public or cultural space if possible.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of criteria.
Yeah.
And
And that's where you
challenging.
worked, actually, was in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was that experience like to be in that, working in that museum, being around all those beautiful pots and
beautiful.
blankets and
It's a-
paintings and
A lot of exercise, walking up and down all
Yeah.
those stairs, and I miss that stair climbing. It was wonderful to be able to, when I was working there, our staff was small. There were maybe not even 20 of us. So I got to do more than just be over the library and the archives. And I worked with the curator and helped with doing exhibits. And I, after we merged with the Autry and several of the curators left, I ended up being in charge for a short period of time of the museum camp property. The collections were fantastic. The Autry, the museum had raised $10 million before the merger with the Autry, and they were thinking about building an on-site storage facility. And then the earthquake, the Northridge earthquake happened, and we got the money, and we never were financially able to use the 10 million. So when they merged with the Autry, they were able to get it was the National NEH gave them, I don't remember which federal agency. They were able to use that money, and then the Autry raised more money, and they were able to move the collections out of the building into the new storage facility. And I've always said, for all the years that I worked in museums, you never are fortunate to be able to handle and look at every single item.
sure.
The whole process, the move process, was fascinating to watch, because they just hired staff just to work on the collection, to handle it,
To move
and to move it. And the Southwest Museum collections were all stored in a 7-story tower, which only had stairs, circular stairs, no elevator. So they had to carry it up or carry it down, depending which floor you were on. And since they'd already had a collection database, and almost every object had been entered through the old cards into the collection database, they were then able to print off barcodes using the accession numbers for each item. They barcoded everything. They surface cleaned what they could. They photographed everything. And every time they moved it from one station to the next, they scanned the barcode so they knew where it was moved.
Nothing got lost.
So nothing got
worse.
lost.
Or worse, right?
And, each
Which-
item had individual mounts made for it.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, I believe, are still in their mounts because they made them so that they could stay in the mounts once they got to the new storage facility. And then they put the items either in trays and boxes, and then they put the boxes in what is called a kiva, which is probably bigger than your desk and wider and taller. So they tracked what box it was in. And then when it was loaded onto the truck, they followed the truck. Sometimes they had security. They had staff in the cars before and back of the truck. And then when they got it to the new storage facility, they scanned everything as it went off the truck. And then they'd put, because when they moved the collection, the back half of the building was just open, and the front half is where I think you said you saw where the shelving and things are. So they left everything in the crates and the kivas, and they had barcodes on the floor. So anytime they moved anything,
Meticulous.
and it was all in the computer. And I'm always like, you never have that option in a museum of handling.
Well, it's so rare to move an entire museum.
To move the entire museum.
Yeah, like
But to
that's not
handle
a thing
everything
that happens all the time.
How many
right?
objects were we talking about? 50,000?
No,
No,
it's a quarter million.
Over probably a 250,000. Depends how you count your archaeological collections. Is it a lot or one item?
My understanding,
So-
Kim, is that that's just what I tell
Yeah.
people, that it's really second only to the Smithsonian Museum and the American Indian in terms of a collection representing indigenous cultures of what's now the United States.
Yeah.
In the United States.
And out of that 250,000 objects, would the majority have been collected during or given to during Lummis's time?
Not at all.
Not at
so
all.
yeah, so that's a funny. It's actually great. I'm glad you asked that, because when I introduce people to the house, I always explain Charles Lummis was the founder of the Southwest Museum, not founder in the traditional sense, though, in the way you're thinking. Everybody's always credited him as the founder of the museum, but he was really the founder in the sense of he was the rallier. Right? Lummis was always hustling people for all of his causes, and that was what he was really good
And
at.
himself.
And
Right.
himself, Well, he was sort of a byproduct. His causes, he needed to be there for all of his causes, right?
Yeah.
And I always said he always knew somebody.
Oh,
that
he's a
he
big
could-
networker.
That was his thing.
and
He was
yeah.
the best analogy for Lummis that I tell people now when I'm introducing Lummis for people who are green is that Lummis was an influencer in every way that you think of influencer culture now, both positive and negative.
Right.
That's what Lummis was in his
Right.
time. Yeah, he was into the networking, the self-promotion, right? And so that is the context under which we credit him as the founder of the museum. It was his brainchild, and he was the one
Right.
that really made it happen. But he wasn't the founder in that traditional sense of generally when we think of a museum, a wealthy philanthropist who gives a lot of money and it's their collection.
Yeah.
Charles Lummis, you would know,
Yeah.
but Charles Lummis's collection is only a tiny fraction
Small.
Yeah.
of that
Actually,
music collection.
the majority of the collection came in during the directorship of Frederick Webb Hodge. Hodge was the director from 32 to when he retired in 55, I think it was.
After Lummis died.
Yeah.
And he was a friend of Lummis's,
Yeah.
but he knew a lot of people after working at the Smithsonian and working at the High Foundation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, he was a big deal.
He was a big deal in developing the collection that way.
Yeah. And that's 32 to what?
About 55,
Yeah,
I
a
think
long
it
time.
was. A long time.
So probably under his tutelage,
That's
a
when the
lot of it came in.
yes, that's when
Yeah.
the majority came.
And it was, at that point, I would assume, really one of the, if not the museum in the Los Angeles area.
Oh, definitely.
It hadn't, Native American things like that were still very in vogue. Because there was a period where it went down, and everyone goes, I think it's going back up.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about Lummis. So he's this gregarious individual, goes to Harvard, drops out, knows Theodore Roosevelt. He walks 3,507 miles, right? 143 days.
That's right.
From September of 1884 till February 1st of 1885, something like that.
Something like
and makes his name, right? Talks to Frank James.
As a publicity stunt, you got
It
that.
is,
Yes.
I mean, he knew it was.
Yeah,
right?
no, explicitly,
Yeah.
but it's funny because again, the lore of Lummis.
Yeah, he's only 25, right? At
Yes,
this time?
he's 25 at the time, but a lot of it because he walked across the country as what he was he was selling articles, right? He had pitched this idea to
to
Harrison
LA
Gray
Times,
Otis,
yeah.
the LA Times, that he was going to do this, a blog
Right.
basically of like, New Englanders' take on walking out to the Southwest
Right.
for the first time. And that's all it was to make, and apparently it was effective. There was a band awaiting him and people joining him on the last several miles.
Right? He talks to Frank James, he breaks
Yes.
his leg or his arm and twists his ankle, gets
Yes.
stuck in the snow, goes to the Isleta, all these things, right? But he comes back when he finally makes the 143 days. He's kind of a star. I don't know how you describe it.
Well,
but
star and also transformed, right? I think my take on the walk has always been, it's always been that it's sort of that.
Especially when in his writing, the Tramp Across the Continent, he wrote 10 years after he did it.
Which was a compilation of those articles, more or less.
But he talks about it transforming him.
Yes.
And when he crosses over into New Mexico, it helps him change his attitudes about Hispanics and Mexicans. Because being an Easterner, I don't like the term. I don't want to offend anybody on the podcast.
He's from Ohio originally, right?
No, he was from the Boston area.
He really was. Okay.
Yeah, he was born in Massachusetts.
Okay.
He ended up in Ohio because that's where his in-laws
I
lived.
see. So that's why he went to Harvard.
He went to Harvard. Yes, he was a New Englander, fully New Englander. Didn't go out to Ohio until shortly. No, he was only there a couple of years, right?
Yeah, he was like there 2 years. He was bored. He'd gotten sick.
Yes, and that's
then
when
he decided he was going to
dropped out, and he said his in-laws lived there. Ostensibly, he was going to manage a farm.
Yeah,
which is not.
Yeah.
That was not for him. So that's where he got his career started as a writer. He was writing for this newspaper in this town, Chillicothe, Ohio.
Yeah.
But I believe he and his first wife then, Dorothea Rhodes, they wanted to come out to California, same reason everyone else was coming out, right? It was the economic opportunity of coming out to post-railroad. Yeah. So that's the other thing. So that's what I was going to emphasize is when we always talk about Lummis and the walk, we talk about the walk, but because, again, it sort of, it adds to the lore a little bit because they hear that and they put him in an earlier context of time normally.
Right.
Yeah.
If you don't, unless you emphasize, no, it would be like somebody doing it now, right? It's a publicity stunt. His wife came on the train. There was no necessity to come walking, right?
Well, and I've always thought it was interesting because I knew his youngest son, Keith Lummis. Yeah. And Keith even confided in us one time that he thought Lummis even rode the train for a bit.
Well, I think people have analyzed the timeline.
Walk all the way.
And there's parts that don't make sense.
Yeah.
And the transformative, I think, part of it too is also, he was inspired. See, now we know because in the narrative of the walk is that he came out like an ignorant New Englander, not knowing really what to expect. And again, it's this transformative event for him. But we know he was inspired by people who came before him, most notably an anthropologist named Frank Cushing, who today is associated with the people of Zuni Pueblo. And so, yes. And we know that Lummis had attended a demonstration that Frank Cushing had gone to Harvard and brought people from Zuni, and Lummis was there. There's lots of people. Helen Hunt Jackson came before Lummis. There's a lot of people we can think of as like, oh, these are the proto-Lummis. Who's sort of taking...
Geronimo hasn't surrendered yet in 1886.
Right.
So he's walking in 1884 and 1885. That's right. Yeah. So he is going through those areas that are still combat areas.
But I think that our narrative arc, one could argue, of that transformative thing. He was also a big fan of this novelist named Mayne Reid, who wrote these. He grew up in that era of like adventure novels
Right.
for young men, and this
Right.
author wrote these books that took place in a fictional Southwest. I don't even know if that author had ever come out to the
I
Southwest.
don't remember.
I don't remember. So it was like, you know, fictional Spanish name places
Right.
and
Right.
Native American groups.
Right.
And but he loved this author, and he loved this guy's books. And again, in almost a lot of his books had to deal with, you know, a white New Englander coming out and being ingratiating himself with the people and becoming immersed in politics and stuff. So you see very clearly that there's a lot of inspiration and a lot of planning, and I don't want to use the word, you know, there's a lot of creation even from the get-go. It's like a creation story.
Well, he wants that, right? I mean, wants to be bigger than life. And my take on him as a person is that he loves to surround himself with famous people and people of note, and wants to be seen in that light as one of those individuals. People like Charlie Russell and individuals that are making movies later on. You know, the cowboys that do that. In fact, you know, one of them is at his funerals, as well as, you know, Dixon and Breen. They're all pallbearers, as you probably well know.
Yeah. And he knew Wyatt Earp.
Really, there's this desire to be culturally prominent. I think. And I think that is something Lummis wasn't part of intellectual or socially really where he came from in New England.
Well, his father was a Methodist minister. So he was
grew up very well educated by his father, which is how he got into Harvard.
Yeah.
But he wasn't, you know, in the Gilded Age in New England. I think Lummis was closer to as much as there was a middle class in the Gilded Age. He didn't grow up poor, but
well, he's born in 1859, right?
That's right, March 1859, and so I think growing up in that era, he was privy to that. Obviously, going to Harvard, right?
Right.
And I think
and meeting people like Teddy Roosevelt.
Right, exactly. But I think in New England, that social strata was so stratified.
Yes.
There's no social upward mobility. And so my argument about the booster movement, that people who came to the West and sort of promoted history and culture in the Southwest, has always been that I think a lot of these people came out here, consciously or not, and just like some people came out, most people who came out on the railroad saw economic opportunity. I think there was the other people who were like Lummis, who saw, and the cultural opportunity. It's a
cultural for them too.
Yes, and so they aspired to that, but they knew they couldn't be that where they came from in the East. So they came out and they saw an opportunity to create that for themselves there, which is complicated.
Yeah, well,
obviously.
He's an enigma in that sense to me.
Yeah.
That he has that component of himself, almost, I would say, and I don't know if this is true, almost narcissistic in a way.
Yes, I would say so.
That's a fair statement to say.
That's a very fair statement.
I always said I would like to know him, but I would never have wanted to be married to him.
Got it.
I don't know if I would have liked him either. It takes a big ego, a monster ego, to accomplish as much as you do, as much as when he did in his lifetime, one person can. Well, and I don't know that's, he was polarizing in his time. Yes. So clearly it wasn't just us. Yeah.
But it's also interesting, as you said, he wanted to, and a lot of people go to the West in California to remake yourself.
Yeah.
But even when he wrote In the Land of Sunshine in like 1895, 96, in an editorial, he was writing about the need for a museum in Los Angeles to bring in culture.
Yeah, and to promote the Southwest.
And to promote the Southwest, but he's still going, we need a museum like New York and Boston and Chicago. Yeah. And it was the same thing when he became the director of the public library for that period of time. It was, we've got to upgrade the library. We need to be more like the eastern cities.
Sure.
So he's like this dichotomy with, I want to be this southwestern man, but yet we have to compete with the East.
Yeah.
And then he has this whole component of really native rights. I mean, he really is involved in, pro-native rights and
when I talk about his transformation and the sort of one conjecture artifice behind it, that doesn't negate, I always say, that the fact that, he did good things and he really meant it. I think sometimes that motivation, that underlying motivation of, again, wanting to be the culturally prominent guy, obviously colors. And I think when you put him in that model, a lot of things make sense. But that doesn't, again, but he really meant it. Like when you when you read his, again, now we critique his approach to a lot of his advocacy, but in terms of his feelings, he had a real genuine affinity for that. So it's a nuanced thing. It's not, he's neither a hero nor villain. It's just it's an interesting.
He's a complex person.
Like all humans are. Histories in the grays. Yes.
Strong, big ego.
Yes.
That can stomp you if he feels necessary.
It is very polarizing.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, talking about the library, he's the second librarian, right? The
No,
first
he was,
one.
there
was quite a few.
Quite
Yeah.
a few librarians.
I think was he the first
he
male
was the
librarian?
First
He was,
male
yeah.
librarian.
Yes.
but-
He was
Yeah.
the first one.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
my understanding, he kind of made that happen, and the other person was quite good, and
Yeah.
she got booted.
Yes,
and
a
he-
much
There-
more
there
capable
was,
woman got fired so that he could.
yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a great Susan Orlean wrote a book called The Library Book recently, which is just about. Well, it's not just about that. I'm sorry. It's about
Yeah.
the fire that happened. It's about
Yeah,
the LA Public
yeah,
Library.
I read about.
Yeah.
I read
Yeah.
that actually.
Oh, it's a great book. I recommend to people. And I always say that book brought in a lot of people to the museum. And I always say if you want a clue, his short and controversial tenure as city librarian, I think gives you a really great clue into the type of personality he was,
Yeah.
Yeah,
and,
and,
how
you
polarizing
know,
it was even at his time.
He was paid more money because he was a man.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, things
And
like
the
that.
other comment was, well, he didn't have a background in library, and the librarian that was forced to leave.
Right.
And it was a whole controversy during almost his whole tenure.
Yeah.
They had women's rights organizations going after him almost the whole entire time.
I always do get a little defensive though, because people tell a short version.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, he ousted. It's like, no, he didn't oust.
No.
The library board did.
The library
But-
board did.
But that ties into what I was saying about this desire for cultural prominence, right? Because he saw that as an opportunity. Again, he didn't have experience as a librarian, but when they asked him, because he was the culturally prominent guy with no experience as a librarian, that was a testament to his cultural prominence.
Right.
So of
But
course
he-
jumped at that opportunity, and it was a job too.
He'd also been
Yeah.
he'd
Yeah.
also been a consultant to the library board in helping them develop collections.
Oh, interesting.
Before that's
Right.
I think how he
Yeah, he
rose
had
to
a connection
prominence and
before.
the connections
Yeah.
to the library board.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
they probably wanted him too because they thought he, as you said to begin, as an influencer, had connections to prominent people
Yes.
that would help them, I'm assuming.
Right.
Because I mean, I see him going as a firefly to the brightest flame, whoever that may be.
Yeah.
Again, you've probably read, both of you, I'm sure, a lot of his writings. Let me just ask you individually, Kim, what's your take on this individual? If you can summarize him in a few paragraphs, and it's hard to do it in a sentence.
It's hard. I always think about Lummis. I was talking to Christian about an idea that I have. I've always said when he saw a need, he created an organization to address the issue. So he created the Landmarks Club of Southern California to help the preservation of missions and historic buildings.
Yeah.
He created the Sequoia League to address the issues of Native peoples. And then he had the Southwest Museum and that was part of the Archaeological Institute of America, which at that time was mainly focused on doing archaeology in, Egypt, classical archaeology, and he was trying to get the interest to come to the Southwest. Yeah. And I think, like Kristen said, I think a lot of what he did, he honestly felt he was doing good for it.
There was a genuine.
And there was a genuine interest, and he maybe was ADHD. I don't know. He was obsessive because he always writes. Like when he was the director of the library, he had at least 2 secretaries that worked with him at Alisal because he slept less than 4 hours a night. And so they would have to be ready during any time of the day. And that's also when he started to have his typed journals, which are different from his handwritten diaries.
Right.
And
he's a prolific writer.
He's a prolific
like the
writer.
volume of written material that this person did is astounding.
Yeah.
Because I was doing research recently, Kim, I didn't even talk to you about this. I was doing research recently in his journals, and for a talk that I gave at the Pasadena Museum of History, and I'm looking at these journals, and there are all these typed journals that are now on, microfilm.
Right.
And I'm looking through it, and then I get to this section that are these round robins.
Yep.
And I'm like, what is that? I don't understand what this means in this context. Why is he calling it this round robins? Oh, well, these are the journals that he would have typed up that might have differed slightly in context or in content compared to his other journals that he would distribute to people that he thought might be interested in what he was doing, like a newsletter.
Yeah.
But imagine, like, if you were typing, like, oh, this is my journal for today. Let me type a slightly different, a little edited journal, and I'm going to hand it out to people like a newsletter because they're going to be interested in what I'm doing. Like, that's crazy. Like, who does this?
Well, he would ask people.
Yeah, exactly.
He asked people to return them with comments.
Right.
So sometimes the comments would be put in a future round robin.
Yeah. Like he's creating again. It's this idea. It's the idea of recording your life, but then also the idea that this is going to be this is not even that this is important in the future. This is important to somebody now. They're going to want to know. They need to know
I want
this.
you to give me comments.
Yeah. I want editing.
Yeah.
You probably may or may not.
Or maybe he changes the way he talks about that from their editing. Yeah, I sound better that way.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. That's what fascinates me. To tell you the honest truth, I'm sure, Kim, I don't know how much you've read of Lummis. I've only read, I always shock people when I say this because I'm in charge of the museum. I've only read a couple of Lummis's books, obviously The Tramp Across the Continent and Some Strange Corners.
A lot more.
Yes, you've read a lot more, I'm sure.
Recently,
Some Strange Corners of Our Country.
I read New Mexico David.
Oh, sure.
I read his Spanish...
The Spanish Pioneers?
The Spanish Pioneers. Yeah. I read the revised edition of the Spanish Pioneers from the 1920s because he includes his analysis and thoughts on the California missions.
That's right.
In that one because the original Spanish Pioneers was from 1895, I think. Mm-hmm. And then he revised it and...
But I find his writing, I always tell people, because sometimes people ask me, they're like, oh, if you have a book you recommend, generally it's Tramp, because that's what most people read. Yeah. But, I always do warn people, at least for me, that his writing isn't, it's not as classic as, say, a Jack London or something like that. It's very of his time. It's I'm not a literary person, so this is difficult for me to describe, but it's a very flowery, overwrought language that's very tedious. Yeah. For a modern reader today, right? Yeah. So, and I think, but I don't know, that even in his time, he wasn't necessarily celebrated as a brilliant writer. I think he was really, it was all tied to that.
Selling himself.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Then his sort of, again, the creation of his persona.
Well, and I've always been fascinated, like his tramp across the continent. And I never thought about it before until I started working at the Autry. And we were discussing what is a pioneer narrative. Mm-hmm. Well, they consider his tramp across the continent a pioneer narrative because, not only because of the time period, but he describes life for those 183 days. Yeah. And it's still considered a classic. Some places still require it. It's still reprinted today, which...
It's astounding for a book of that genre from that era.
Yeah.
There's not too many. There's not too many. It just attests
to
his larger than life.
Because of all my thoughts, I've been reading different authors' thoughts on Lummis's writing.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Which is
Yeah. What other thoughts?
Contemporary at that time.
No. This was. What's his name? The editor of the Southwest. He's the Huntington.
Oh, Bingham.
Bingham.
Yes. The first book that was written on Charles Lummis was called Editor of the Southwest, and was a book about Charles Lummis as a writer and editor, not a biography.
Right.
Yeah.
It was published by the Huntington in 55?
Yeah, and that's reprinted as well. And that's an interesting analysis of Lummis's writings.
Was it positive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He has an interesting take on Lummis, too, actually. It's funny about that book. I recommend that. So
I would recommend it.
that book is a good book as far if you're interested, again, in an analysis, a literary analysis of Lummis, because that's what the book focuses on. But the first chapter of that book is just a primer on Lummis's life. It was actually a thesis.
Yeah.
The thesis, by the way, is at UCLA. Sorry, now we're having our own side conversation because we're catching up. I haven't seen her in a couple of years. It's at UCLA. You can read the thesis version of that book. And so
in 55?
In 1955, he was a graduate student. Before that, the book was published in 55. I don't remember exactly what year he got what he completed the thesis, but it had a different title, much more not great title. I don't remember what it was.
So like a quarter century after his death is when he's writing.
Yes. And what's fascinating about that is the first chapter of that book is just a primer on Lummis's life so that you have context for what he's writing about, which again is mostly a literary analysis. That primer of Lummis's life, I would say, is the best thing that's been written about Lummis ever. Ironically, one of the earliest things, because it's the one that gives him that critical angle that I give him, that we give him today. You know, looking back historically, a lot of the later things that were written about Lummis are things that are matter-of-fact retellings at best. Yes, you know, she knows exactly which books I'm talking about. Matter-of-fact retellings of Lummis's creation.
Than life.
Yes, the bigger in life, the tall tales and the folkloric idea of Lummis. And this Bingham guy wrote, he'd love it. But this guy, Bingham, had a really spot on primer. I always say if you want just to read a short thing about Lummis, you read the first chapter of that book. It's a good one. And the Huntington still publishes it.
Do you think he was a polymath?
Lummis?
Yeah. Like a Renaissance man?
I mean, yeah, I defend it.
He's a writer.
I think it depends on. I think it depends also on how you want to define that and how deep, you know, because one could be a jack of all trades but a master of none.
Yeah, so that's what a polymath. He has to actually have mastery of over
at least a couple.
Yeah.
I mean, as I always said,
He's an editor. He's a writer.
He was a
writer.
he was a photographer.
He's a librarian.
The photography.
He was never a museum director.
No, he was never the director of the museum. But he
we'll
was.
Catch you on that.
The photography is what something people are really paying more attention to now.
Yeah.
I was just another excuse to come out here was I was just at the University of Arizona looking at their archives of Lummis material.
Yes.
I took so many pictures I haven't even had a chance to show you, and of what they have, because I think that material there is not represented in the.
Has anyone done a book on his photography?
Yes, Patrick Houlihan.
Patrick Houlihan did one
in the 80s called Lummis in the Pueblos, but his is focusing on the photography of the Pueblos.
On the Pueblos.
And he was obviously much more prolific than that.
Yeah.
And but I think now people are noticing his photography because I don't think he thought of him. He didn't think of himself as an art photographer.
No, I'm sure not.
I think
I did at that time.
Right, but I think.
Well, and he learned it. I mean, because his camera that he used, he bought the same camera that he saw C.S. Fly use
in 1886.
86 when Lummis was out here trying to cover the Apache Wars.
Yeah.
And he does credit, there's somebody wrote an article actually on the camera, but I did find in the archives a bill of sale, and he said this is the same camera that C.S. Fly used.
Did he know C.S. Fly?
He must have met him when
they
he
were
was there in
time.
Tombstone.
Incidentally, his camera was on display at the Arizona History Museum. I was just there yesterday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
C.S. Fly's camera.
Yeah. So but it's interesting, and he did any of the black and white photographs that you see credited to him, especially if they're like cabinet cards or something, he didn't print. Any of the cyanotype photographs, he may have printed, or his wife and children may have printed.
Whenever
but
times
they are
were tough, they would go into production on making these little booklets. You see a lot of his photographs in these hand-bound booklets that are all cyanotypes. But I think a lot of people now are paying attention, and I was struck at I'll show you some pictures after we're done, but I was struck at the beauty of some of the photos that he took at Alisal of his children.
Yeah, he's got some beautiful.
They're so beautiful and printed in the cyanotype, and so that gives them an even more sort of ethereal quality to them. They're very interesting. So now I think a lot of people are starting to note his photography.
Yeah, I mean,
more
I'm
so.
sure he sees things in an art form because he obviously likes art. I mean, he has, many of his friends, his pallbearers are artists.
Well, and the house is an
Well,
extension of his
of course.
artistic bent. But I think in terms of his photography, he really kind of, before the term was really coined, I think he thought of himself more as a photojournalist.
I think it's more a vernacular photojournalist.
I mean, he just used, the photography was just an extension of what he did with everything else in his life, was just document everything.
So some of the individuals that he knew that maybe I didn't know, but so Wyatt Earp he knows.
But for a short period of
this,
time when he was there in L.A.
Oh, sure, because people have asked me that, but I didn't know that.
Sure,
I didn't know that unequivocally. Yeah.
So Lucky Baldwin, Wyatt Earp gets married on his ship.
Oh, I didn't know
on
this.
his boat.
Yeah.
Wyatt Earp does. So Baldwin knows him.
Sure.
And Dixon knows Lucky Baldwin. Anita Baldwin is big, patron. So I wonder what that connection is there too. If he knew him through Lucky Baldwin, my guess is yes.
It could be
because he would have definitely wanted to know Lucky Baldwin.
Sure.
There's no doubt he knew Anita Baldwin.
Well, we saw in the museum
Through through Dixon. Dixon was important. So, so that's one individual. I didn't really know that he knew. It does not surprise me. What are the other individuals that stick out in your mind, important, maybe creative artist ones? We'll talk about Dixon alone, but that
in Lummis's world?
Yeah.
Oh, geez. Well, all the big names. I mean, So we've got, there's obviously this
obviously
genre
Bourrine is important.
Bourrine.
We'll talk about him.
And I mean, that's the whole thing. I mean, Frederick Remington.
Yeah.
All of the Thomas Moran.
So you say Frederick Remington. In what way does he know Frederick Remington?
Well, we know he was a visitor to the house.
Yeah.
And I don't know how deep their friendship was.
Well, and Remington lived there in Pasadena.
Yeah. Well, or did he live there, or did they build the house? Do you know?
Well, I know he lived there, but I don't know if it was actually during the Remington.
Because I think he died right after they built that house.
So he dies in 1909.
Yeah.
Frederick Remington.
Yeah.
But he probably knew Lummis.
Yeah, I'm sure. No, well, he was a visitor to the house.
He was a visitor.
So that we know unequivocally because we have the house book and Remington sign.
He knew Curtis.
Yeah.
He knew.
I know he knew Curtis.
Yes.
Jackson.
Jackson.
What's his name?
The photographer.
The photographer.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
He knew him.
We were discussing A.C. Vroman in terms of the photographer. Photographer. Now we're in the photography.
Yeah.
But Thomas Moran, did I mention Thomas Moran?
No.
Thomas Moran was also...
He knew George Wharton James.
Yeah.
George Wharton James. Sorry.
They didn't like each other.
The artist, yeah.
Well, he knew him.
They're enemies.
And he knew Frank Hamilton Cushing.
You said James were enemies, is what you said?
George Wharton James,
yes.
And Lummis?
Yeah. If somebody was
he
a
wrote
man...
the basket book.
Yes.
Right.
If somebody was a man and very similar to Lummis, generally it was competition. So they were. I think that's not what Lummis said, but I think that's what it is.
And do we know this through his writing?
Oh yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Lummis wrote harsh critiques of George Wharton James's
research,
books and research.
Everything.
Yes, because he thought that they were just god awful. But again, you have to color it with.
Right.
You see it as sort of
similar personalities, I think.
Yes.
Because it really is telling that it wasn't until after Lummis died that James's collection started being donated to the Southwest Museum. Books and objects.
Yeah. And of course, George Wharton James lived just up the Arroyo in Pasadena.
Yeah.
So which was way too similar.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, but in terms of artists, there's a fine artist.
Borg. He knew Borg.
Yeah.
Borg, Carl Oscar Borg.
For sure.
Which there is a mural at El Alisal, which, oddly enough, it's based on. It's one of the historic features of the house. I say it's the oldest art mural in Los Angeles. I'm not sure if that's necessarily true, but that's what I'm branding it as because I can't think of an earlier one. Somebody painted a mural on the back porch of El Alisal, and it's based on one of Lummis's more widely published photographs of a girl named Charina Reyes, a Southern Tehuet girl in Isleta, Pueblo. It's one of the photos he took during the time he was living in Isleta.
Right.
And he had somebody do a painting, and as far as we can tell, it's one artist. I've had an art historian come with a pretty based on what it looks like, that it might be Carl Oscar Borg, but we don't know.
Send me an image.
Yeah, I'll send you. Oh yes, that's right. I'll ask. Yeah, you would know, but it's hard to tell because it looks unfinished and it's not signed, obviously. But obviously the answer is there. It's just that somebody hasn't researched it yet.
Yes, I
mean, and so, but it's one of those odd things about the house. There's so much,
and we know that was
content
from that time frame.
Oh yeah, because it's in the historic photos.
Yeah,
it's in Lummis's photos from around the turn of the century that they're starting.
Yeah, so you can figure it out.
Yeah, and we have the guest book, and we know who was there at what time because that's been indexed.
Yes.
So now we just have to compare that with his diaries and see where he writes that.
Yeah.
But oddly, the thing about that house, it's so fascinating, is again, I jokingly say all the time, we have the opposite problem most historic sites have, or as I mentioned, we have too much information about this house. It's photographically, the most photographically documented house in its historic context. Right. And he has his diaries and his guest book. There's receipts for the lumber. I mean, it's ludicrous, the amount of level of, and so nobody's, detail, and nobody's been able. But it sometimes is a problem because again, it's finding a simple answer to who painted this prominent mural on the back porch is a little more involved because there's so much content to go through. Right. But I'm hoping to do that soon. Yeah. So we know it might be Borg, but I'm going to send you an image.
Yeah, there's a lot of different people.
Yes,
it could be Dixon.
It could be. I don't know, but it looks more like Carl Oscar Borg. But again, you would know better than I.
He has a very distinctive style. So
he does. Yes.
Yeah. More pastel colors too.
Yes.
Things like that.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
But who else?
I know. I think we mentioned most of the big ones in terms of fine artists.
Yeah. Charlie Russell's a big one.
Charlie Russell. Oh my gosh, thank you. I knew we was missing somebody. Yes.
Russell.
Yeah, Charlie Russell, of course.
And that whole thing, it's very interesting. I've done some research between Charlie Russell, Dixon, and Lummis. Mm-hmm. And so what's your take on that? Do you know? And then I'll give you mine, if any.
Kim might have more of a take on it because that's not my area.
Or have you read any letters between Lummis and Russell or vice versa?
I haven't had a reason to yet.
But no, I never really.
Well, you indexed all the correspondence, but it's been so long.
Yeah, I don't think I
She's the one that created the finding aid to all this correspondence.
I think of Russell more as later when Hodge is there, so...
Oh, interesting. So he was involved with the Southwest Museum even after Lummis? Russell? Interesting.
Yeah, he dies in 28.
Yeah.
Oh.
26. Russell dies in 26.
Oh, so he dies before Lummis then?
Yeah, he dies before Lummis, but
Lummis does. Or Charlie Russell does.
Interesting.
So...
No, but I would love to hear your take.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very interesting thing because... I think Lummis, again, has this affinity for famous people.
Yes.
And Russell's a famous person, and his wife's made sure that he has lots of photographs out there and very well known. And Russell hangs out with all these cowboys that are in the movies that are important, and he's an important guy. He's Dixon thinks he's an important guy, really important guy.
Yeah.
And he admires him for his narrative, the way he paints narratively. But then you have Lummis, who really likes Russell and wants to be with Russell when he can, when he's in L.A. Mm-hmm. And he goes to like one of his birthday parties in 1924. Mm-hmm. Lummis is there with Russell, Dixon, and Borg, and Breen's there as well.
Where was it?
It was somewhere in L.A.
Okay.
I have to look and see exactly where. It was in L.A. basically. Mm-hmm. And Dixon's not there. He's not invited. Don't know why, but because they're doing photographs and things. Dorothea Lange's taking photographs of Russell in Dixon's studio in 24. Russell comes down and spends time with Dixon. They like to talk about different things, the Old West, the people. They're similar in the way they really appreciate history and understand history. And so Dixon, in 24, doesn't get invited to this thing. Russell makes a big deal, or not Russell, Lummis makes a big deal of this birthday party. Dixon puts a painting into a gallery show in 24 called The Lone Survivor. And big painting, he wins. He wins the big award for it, which was $3,000, I think.
Oh, wow.
A lot,
yeah.
Right? And it's of this train of buffalo, the last surviving buffalo. And then Charlie Russell shows that this was I think it was at the Biltmore Salon. He shows 2 months later, and I think Nancy does that because Nancy doesn't like, because Russell's wife does not like Dixon, because he competes too much with Russell. She doesn't want that, just kind of like Hodges.
Right.
Yep.
But Russell doesn't care. He likes him.
Right.
So sometime after that, and then you have the birthday party, Dixon destroys that lone survivor painting. Erased. Even though it wins, and it's important, because it's too much like, I think Dixon thinks it's too much like Russell's.
Oh,
And
interesting.
he wants to show Lummis he's not Russell.
Wow.
When,
I know. He's an interpreter of the West, not somebody who does literal, the old buffalo going down the trail.
Yes.
Right.
Literal.
Yes.
And I think that it was affected to that. He was literally going, okay, I'm not him.
Right.
So you have to realize Dixon calls Lummis father.
yeah.
Well, that's what we were discussing because,
Yeah.
of course, in the museum next door here, you have the thing that says "Pop." I forgot that.
Pop and
Yeah.
father. He
But it
calls him
wasn't-
son.
Yeah.
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 He's very much a father figure for Dixon.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so Dixon's dad dies in 1898 in a mental institution, basically.
Okay.
And young, Dixon's young himself, whatever he's 23 at that time. Dixon meets Lummis in 1895, right? And they hit it off right away. And Dixon continues to look toward Lummis for advice, serious advice. Like in 1918, he writes to Lummis about he's done. He can't paint anymore. Dixon literally has gone. He loses this big commission for $5,800 in the Northern Railroad. His wife and he get divorced. The pandemic happens. Just everything is not great in his life. He's depressed, and Dixon has depression throughout his life, and which is sometimes called rheumatism, I think.
Right.
And the thing,
Those
but
have their
he's
euphemisms,
yeah.
right?
So he writes Lummis, and he says, "I'm done. I can't do it anymore. I'm finished." And Lummis writes him back, "No, you can." Thomas Hill was able to paint way into his late years, and you have so much ahead of you. And so he takes that to heart and starts painting again. So that's one thing. But then if you see others where he talks about Lummis, in that same time frame in 1918, he goes down to see Lummis and to talk to him, and he, from San Francisco all the way during a pandemic, and the war is still going on or just ending. He goes down and he writes about Lummis. He walks in and tries to talk to Lummis, and he ignores him, Dixon, for whatever reason. And he goes, "I just left and walked out. I couldn't even be around him." And, he broke his heart at that moment. And there's another one in 1907. He's just gotten, the letter was in 1907, and Dixon, 1906 was the letter, right after the great earthquake, right, of April 18th, big problem there. And Dixon gets PTSD from that, I believe. I think that haunted him forever, though he would deny that completely. But he writes about, he wants to go see Sam Day, who's this important trader, go out and basically get the hell out of, San Francisco area and be with, in the lonesome, which is what he loves, right? He loves to be in the desert because it makes him feel better, especially after that earthquake. And he writes to Day, and then he goes, "I heard Lummis was there. How was that?" exclamation mark. And you could feel it, like there was something. And now, so Lummis is doing his thing, right? He's getting ready to, start this, or go however you place the museum. And, I think he may have been struggling a bit as well. So, you see this over and over, this back and forth between Dixon and Lummis. And, it's a father figure. Dixon, I think, uses him, and others. Lorenzo Hubbell's another father figure. There's a few of them in his life. And, but Lummis can just squash him at any moment, emotionally, and does on occasion, but also can save him.
Yeah.
I wonder.
And Lummis, depending if it's in writing or not, Lummis could be really vitriolic in his writing about people.
Yeah.
And Ted, shreds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see any of those? Are there any Dixon letters or Lummis letters?
Not that I've ever seen it.
I've seen Lummis letters where he's...
To Dixon?
No,
Not
not
to
to Dixon.
Dixon.
I've
But to where he's vitriolic?
No.
Oh, I have. Yes.
Oh, to Dixon?
No, not to Dixon. Just generally.
Generally.
I was doing research for a talk I mentioned earlier. I gave at the Pasadena Museum of History last year, and I read a letter. The purpose of my talk was to talk about the relationship he had with a woman named Eva Fenyas, who was an artist herself, and not a trained artist, but she was a New York socialite who had settled in Pasadena in around this period, I think around the turn of the century or just before. And she was had her own business and was immersed herself, like so many others. So we were just discussing earlier in this southwestern thing, right? The southwestern culture. So she becomes friendly with Lummis and all of these people that they were, and of course Eva Fenyas was one of the founding members of the museum, and it was the big, a big contributor to all of Lummis's causes. And so anyway, so the Pasadena Museum of History today is on the site that is her grounds, the house, her house is there. And so that gave a talk about their relationship. I found out that they had met, because Lummis in his years later in his journals reminisces that he had met through a writer named Grace Ellery Channing, who was married to another artist, Charles Walter Stetson. Yeah. And anyway, so me just doing research on this, I thought, okay, well, let me read their correspondence. And my only purpose was to find
about this other person.
Yeah, like, meet this person, the introduction. That was my only purpose. And it wasn't a big correspondence file, so I thought, okay, I'll plow through this. It'll be easy. So I read their correspondence. And Grace Ellery Channing, who was at one point an assistant editor of Lummis's magazine, I believe, and a writer, was a letter from her to him about a poem that he had published in his magazine that he was the editor of. It wasn't his magazine.
Land of Sunshine?
It was originally Land of Sunshine. Later changed names to Out West, but it was a magazine that he was the editor of. And they had published a poem that she had not been paid for yet. And then she had submitted something else that she hadn't got a response on yet. So the letter was just addressing both those things. When am I going to get paid? Or when are you going to give me a response? Because I can go to Harper's or I can go to wherever if you don't want this, whatever. And it wasn't rude or anything. It was just like, we're following up on this. And he writes her a letter back that was jarring to read because, I mean, this isn't literally what it says, but the tone of the letter is like, you should be lucky you're getting paid kind of thing. But in a... It was the rudest, condescending letter I had read in a long time, which fascinating to me, again, because I wasn't even looking for this, but it ties into something I had been talking to a scholar about Lummis not that long before, about Lummis as being a big supporter or a big promoter of women writers in his magazine. And Charlotte Hall was the assistant editor of his magazine at some
Dixon
point.
Knew.
Mary Austin. There's a lot of people who were published in his magazine.
And Mary Austin didn't like him after.
No, they did not get along.
After he divorced Eve.
Yes, because she was very friendly with Lummis's second wife, Eve Douglas. But I was talking with the scholar, and we couldn't make sense of that. We were like, it's so weird because in Lummis's personal life, he wasn't quite the feminist. So you figure, how do you reconcile those two things? And then that's when I had already had this discussion with this scholar, and then that's when I realized, it's because unlike George Wharton James, he didn't see them as competition. Right. And I think he wasn't threatened by them. So he could have all of these female authors because they're doing similar things that are contributing to his work, but he's not threatened by them because he doesn't see them as common. So that tracks. And then I had read that letter. But speaking of vitriolic, the letter was, to your point, the most cutting. I mean, it was jarring to read. I was like, I don't remember the last time I've read somebody being this condescending to somebody. And poor Grace Ellery Channing, of course, he kept copies outgoing and incoming of the correspondence. So you see her response to him, and she's kind of like trying to calm him down. Yeah. And be like, like, it's okay. You know what I mean? Like, and you just feel for her so badly because you're like, oh God, she probably had to put up with, but he was publishing her.
Yeah.
So like you kind of just have to put up with
So
this,
yeah,
you know,
when he
asshole.
attacks her, when he feels, I think this is how I interpret it.
Yeah.
When he feels that she is attacking him personally
Yeah.
by saying, "Where's my money?"
Right.
Well, you know, I can go to other places.
Right.
Yeah.
Then that triggers him
Correct.
to be, you know, whether it's the narcissism and whatever.
Correct.
You don't do that to me.
Narcissism and
You
chauvinism,
know?
I think, at this
Yeah.
point, for
and
sure.
he just unloads on her.
So I wonder
that
if it's
was-
something similar with
Dixon.
Dixon.
I'm sure.
Like, do you feel like in the stuff that you've read, you felt like there was some trigger for
For Dixon, I'm sure.
Right.
But, you know, that could be from his father as well, right?
Sure.
He sees him as his father. He talks to him as
Right.
his father. His father's dead. His father's a veteran, you know, from the Civil War who had all sorts of problems. Well, you know, he went through those battles.
Yeah.
And so when Lummis doesn't give him, you know, the time of day or the admiration, or worse, spurns him, it affects him not just as an artist talking to somebody who's in the publishing, but as a father.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
So
hurting.
it's deeper than
and,
just
and I'm sure
rejection.
Lummis knew how to do this. You know, he knew how to pull these things.
I think
Yeah.
Lummis
Yeah.
was sort of manipulative in that way.
I would think, but
I
yet Dixon,
read the
yeah. But I was going to say, but yet Dixon gets
Yeah.
married, right?
right.
You
At
know,
Alisal.
May
At
5th
Alisal,
under at Alisal under
Yeah.
that sycamore, and
It was
same
still
with
important to him
Bereen
to have-
in
yeah.
May of 21.
That's right.
So you were about to say something.
Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say with
About his manipulative
about his
nature.
manipulative nature. And I don't know how much they allow people to access it now. But the family had asked us kind of not to let researchers look at it. He had all this horrible statements against Eve
Oh, sure.
This was his wife.
in
His
their
second wife,
his
yeah.
second wife
Yeah.
Yeah.
in their divorce files
Yeah.
and in the
Oh,
Autry collection.
oh my God! Speaking of
And
vitriolic, I forgot about that.
They my have curly hair.
Yeah.
They made my hair curl more.
Yeah, Lummis had no scruples if you were in his
he
crosshairs.
was
He had no
awful.
qualms. He
Awful with
yeah,
her.
I totally forgot about that. Yeah, in that divorce, Lummis built Alisal, his house,
Yeah.
for he and his second wife, a
Yeah.
woman named Eve Douglas, and
He was awful.
yeah,
Was that the son that passed away from that marriage?
Yes, Lummis
Armando-
only had 4
Armando.
children with his. Lummis had 5 children altogether that we know of.
Yeah, that we know of.
5 confirmed. 4 children with his second wife Eve, who he built El Alisal for, and their oldest son was named Amado. Yeah, who passed away.
And Amado, when do they get divorced in relationship to his son's death?
It's still a solid 10 years,
No,
or is it less than that?
it's less than that. There's
Because
some
Amado
people.
dies in 1900.
Some people. Well, it's about 7 years, but
Yeah.
then it's when some researchers have thought that this death of their son
Yeah,
really kind of started their decline.
yeah,
I'm
the
sure.
catalyst.
and
Yeah.
and the catalyst for some thoughts as to when he started having more affairs with like his secretaries,
More
and
flagrant
things.
affairs than
Right.
More
originally.
flagrant.
Yeah.
And she left him what in 1907.
Same time that
9. Yeah.
1909 or 7.
1909. Their divorce
I don't
was
recall offhand.
final.
It's so funny because I was just
Their
looking through her
divorce
papers.
wasn't final until 1911, I think.
Correct, and she was already living here in
She
Tucson.
was already here in Tucson.
Yeah,
And again, and you were talking about who Lummis knew. Well, because of Eve,
Mm-hmm.
he was getting funding from Phoebe
That's
Epperson
right.
Hearst to publish the magazine.
Why was he getting that from Phoebe Hearst to Eve? What was that
No,
connection?
it was Eve and Phoebe were friends.
they were
That's it.
friendly.
Okay,
right.
so there
So that's how they got the funding. And then once Eve
So he utilized her network
and
too.
once
Right.
Eve left him, she went to
Yes.
Berkeley, wherever,
Um,
San Francisco. She was up in the Bay Area anyway.
yes.
And so Eve stayed with Mrs. Hearst.
Mm-hmm.
And Eve took Turbase, the daughter, and Keith, the youngest son, and Jordan, the older son that was alive, stayed with Lummis
At Alisal.
and Alisal. And that's when Mrs. Hearst stopped funding
Right.
Land of Sun out west. And that's kind of when
The end of
the end of everything, the end of his being the city librarian, the end of the magazine, the end of the only organization that stayed alive really was the Southwest Society, because he was still fundraising to build the Southwest Museum. He kept the Landmarks Club going. It kind of actually limped along until the Santa Barbara earthquake in 1925.
That's right. Had a little resurgence.
But so again, he wasn't, as I always said, he wasn't a wealthy man.
Right.
But he knew people.
wealthy people.
Yeah,
knew
he was
wealthy people.
connected.
Very well.
Yes, you cannot get more wealthy than that.
And so that separation and divorce really kind of
it really coincides with the end of his cultural prominence.
Yes.
Well, he fractures
That's
that.
when he goes blind.
Right.
Maybe.
I think years ago, two ophthalmologists did an article based on
Yes,
it. Were you
they
involved with
did.
that?
Yes.
And they published in it wasn't a journal, but it was like a magazine, journal, hybrid kind of thing. And they examined his blindness as much as they could without obviously having a body to examine.
And what did they say?
The man was not blind.
Yeah,
I mean, we can't say unequivocally.
You can't just go blind
but,
generally
and then regain it is the thing.
He
And the
blamed
timing
it on
of
the
things.
Guatemalan
fever or something.
that he got.
And what years when was he blind?
When he was divorcing his second
When
wife.
he was divorcing his second wife, and part of the divorce decree, he and Eve were supposed to trade sons.
Oh.
He was supposed to have Keith, the youngest boy, because Keith would have been like 4.
Yeah.
Jordan was
10,
11. But that trade never happened.
Right.
And his son dies in 1900?
He's
No,
the oldest
that's
son.
the
That's his
oldest
oldest
son,
son.
Amato.
Yeah.
He dies in 1900?
1900, Christmas Eve in 1900, yeah.
So it's, it's interesting to think of this 1907 time frame where he's going blind, right?
Yeah. Well, he doesn't go blind till later, but
Yeah, when they were with the height of the divorce.
With the height.
A lot of his...
Which is kind of in that time frame, it sounds like a little bit.
It's a little bit after, 1907, but
because if you think about it, though, because Dixon writes this thing to Lummis, he writes this to Sam Day in 1906 about, how was that? Exclamation mark.
Right.
So Lummis is obviously having problems, and which would make sense.
Right.
His son's been gone for 6 years. The marriage is falling apart. She's doing her thing.
Well,
He's
it was
having
a
multiple
very public, very
affairs.
ugly divorce. That's what brought this up.
Yeah.
We were talking about the vitriol.
Yeah.
Lummis invented stories and put it out there that
Yeah.
were awful,
Again,
that
because
accused friends of
she looks-
child molestation and this kind of stuff. I mean, really crazy. Like if you wronged him, again, the level of vitriol. And so you can imagine in a divorce, right?
Yeah.
And I think
he fractured his way to get money for his business.
well,
Right.
and that's where he went so hard with the vitriol, and so in that divorce that it was so public, and and so that's why, like Kim says, like that's really, he divorces his second wife, and that's sort of the decline of his cultural prominence, and a lot of it's his own doing because he
go
couldn't
after
help
her?
himself.
The Hearsts at all?
No.
Okay. Essentially, Dixon doesn't like Randolph Hearst, by the way, at all.
That's not
Well,
surprising.
he never
In
says
fact,
anything.
1899, he is the chief editor for the Sunday San Francisco Examiner. Dixon's in charge of the art department.
Yeah.
And Dixon says Hearst almost put him in a mental institution.
Oh, geez.
So he didn't like him at all from that point on, or people like that,
Well,
whatever
Lummis
that
never
is.
really said much about Randolph Hearst. It was always Phoebe.
Because that's the one he had a personal
was
connection.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
interesting. That's right at 1900.
Yeah.
Right when just trying to put the timeline.
Well, and that's also when he's in 07 is when he's beginning the museum,
Right.
and they get this collection because in early days of the Land of Sunshine, he was featuring collections, especially Southern California and archaeology. So they get the Frank M. Palmer collection, which is mainly Southern California archaeology, and they got another collection. So then they hire, what's this man's name? I can't remember his name right now. They hired maybe it was Palmer. They hired Palmer to start to inventory the collection. So Lummis more like in 10, 11, I don't remember quite the dates, but later on, he was accusing Palmer of things, of bad practices, taking money.
Yeah.
And then when the museum, the Southwest Museum gets built and they have a board, and he was he was the treasurer
Palmer?
no, they got him off it. And then Lummis was the secretary treasurer of the Southwest Museum. Then he started being accused by some of the other board members of the same thing
As Palmer.
And Lummis had said he had one will, and I think again he didn't want the collection to go to Eve. So in 1911 he signed over the house and the collection to the Southwest Museum. And then when Lummis gets accused of his improprieties, financial improprieties, the board turns back over Alisal.
Right.
And I think they kept the collection, but I don't remember. And they gave it back to them.
Back at that, yeah.
And then it
Is
was
that
in
what-
15 or 16, somewhere in there, they sever the ties with
Yes.
Lummis. And then Lummis has all this.
Is that when he started that Institute of Man
Yes,
or whatever it was
Institute of
called?
the-
Yeah, he tried
Institute
to
of the West.
It's right. He
Institute of
tried
the
to
West.
start this other thing,
That's-
but again, but this is now all coinciding
All
with
coinc-
divorce,
yeah.
and
And
so
the Southwest
politics just
Museum
came to a-
says, no, you're out. In
Yeah.
It was in 15 or 16?
It
before
was
that, I think it was divorce
14,
time. No,
15, no.
Oh, okay, I thought it
no,
was
he
earlier.
was still on it. He was still part of it when the museum opened.
oh right, yeah, that's
And
right.
then he was off, and then it wasn't until 24,
24 that he went back.
when the museum agreed to take back Alisal in the museum and made him curator emeritus, gave him a stipend.
Yeah.
Right, yeah,
And then the 7-story tower
right was named for
was
Lummis,
named
the
for
Caracal
Lummis,
Tower
the Lummis
there.
Caracal
Do you think they did
Tower.
all this because they said, okay, he's not in great health? And
I don't know that his health
You
was
know.
that
Well, he
awful at that
knew,
point. But I think
why do they do that? Why do they give
you know what's
that back to
interesting?
him?
So what's interesting again about Lummis, because it's funny
Yeah.
because this is a perfect segue, because we were talking about all these negative things that contributed to his decline in cultural prominence. But like I mentioned at the beginning, despite that, he had been so adept at creating this image for himself that even though cultural influences in Los Angeles had changed, what I talk about at Alisal a lot is how Lummis's idea of Los Angeles as a sort of center of culture in the Southwest. That's why the Southwest Museum is in Los Angeles. And what's interesting today, of course, is that even in Los Angeles, people don't, which is kind of peculiar if you
Don't
think
know
about
about
it. Well, they don't even think of Southern California as part of the American Southwest.
No, I know.
because and it's like
Yeah.
when it's the literal southwestern
Yeah.
corner of the United States, but just also historically
Right.
speaking, not just colonial history, but indigenous history,
Right.
is the history of Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, and
Yeah.
Northwest Mexico are extremely tied. They were one place. And so that was Lummis's vision. And again, he was so adept at creating this image for himself and this vision. So even though Hollywood came and there was all those kinds of other industrial influence in Southern California and all of these other changes that happened, that's obscured that original vision of Los Angeles as the capital of the
Yeah.
Southwest. People still had it's like a little layered nostalgia. They were already having nostalgia for the nostalgia that Lummis was creating a generation before.
Right.
So people would refer to Charles Lummis and those later years as Don Carlos, like as though he was some early pioneer
Yeah.
who came in the Rancho era of Southern California. Like he came out of the train, or
Right.
came out the same era as the railroad when everyone else came out.
Right.
But
Yeah.
yet he was so adept at creating this image and this persona, and the house reinforces that architecturally,
Right.
everything about that. And that's part of why the house was fought to be preserved as a new house, because it was such a great creation. People latched onto it. So even though the cultural prominence waned, they still, again, treated him like he was some sort of cultural relic himself. They revered
He wanted
him.
that, though.
This is again, that was his whole goal. So I don't
Yeah.
think he was disappointed
And
about
he
that
was-
necessarily. I think the big vision of what he wanted went away.
Yeah.
But as far as what he wanted out of it, I think that came to pass for sure.
Yeah.
People still went to him and thought and saw him as an authority on these things, even after his prominence waned.
There was, I forget the date, is it 26? When they had that big conference in Santa Fe, the Pueblo Indian Collier, and Lummis was invited to that.
Yeah.
Right.
So Lummis was still known.
Yes.
Sure.
And still had some kind of influence in
And still
those
traveling
days,
to,
and still traveling.
traveled to Santa Fe regularly and was very well known there.
Yeah, and again, you know, I'm sure he promoted, I'm a friend of Teddy Roosevelt's.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big photo, right? In the house, he was so proud of the photo that he took.
Somebody
of
like
himself.
Collier's going to be,
Yeah.
You know,
exactly.
we knew Teddy.
He's still the connected guy, even
Yeah.
if he doesn't have the actual, official influence anymore.
Right.
He's still connected.
Do you think he's still relevant today?
What I say about would vary, but not in the reason that Lummis intended, right? I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Lummis. And so first off, there's a lot of lessons, just like history. This is what I always say to people, because sometimes, obviously, we live in a very polarizing time where nuance is kind of difficult nowadays. But there's a whole lot to critique about Lummis's approach to his Native American advocacy, and
in a good way.
critique. Well, there's a lot of lessons to be learned about what not to do. I think his positions are very much on the right side of history.
Yeah.
His approach to how to make those happen, again, we look at very critically now. But what I always say to people is about history, when we're just philosophizing about history, is just like on a personal level, we tend to learn more from our mistakes than our triumphs, right? I think history is the same way. So when sometimes people get perturbed and they're like, well, why are you focusing on the negative? I get that sometimes when I'm talking critically about Lummis. And it's like, well, no, but that's where the lessons are. Like, there's things to learn. Yes, there's things to celebrate, but there's also things to learn from the mistakes. That's the lofty goal of history, which never comes to pass, which is to learn from our mistakes.
Yeah.
But that's part of the goal. So there's that. But then the positive spin I put on Lummis's legacy, which is still very pertinent today, especially I find in Southern California, is what Lummis was trying to do in his own special way, which again, we critique the specific methods of how he was trying to do it. But what he was trying to do was get people to think about the history and culture of the Southwest, which in his mind was very definitively, now we have a broader definition of it, but in his mind very strictly, the history of Spanish colonization of what's now the Southwest and the indigenous cultures of the Southwest. And he wanted people within the United States to think about that history as a part of the popular narrative of the history of the United States. And not
just East Coast.
Right.
Yeah.
Because arguably, I mean, I'm not that young anymore, but I think when I went to school, like when I think of how we learned U.S. history, we came in the Mayflower, we formed 13 colonies, growing up in California, and we had Manifest Destiny and came out west. And you learn California history, but it's in this separate island that's not put into context with what's happening at the same time in the East Coast. And Lummis was trying to blend those things together, and I think that is very worthwhile in terms of his legacy, and super ahead of his time in terms of thinking about and its impact on historiography, is that connection, what scholars refer to now as the borderlands, right? The connection of the Southwest with Northwest Mexico.
New Mexico.
And Northwest Mexico.
Yes, all
right?
that.
Sonora, Baja California.
It was all the same.
It was all the same. And Lummis acknowledged that.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
he knew history. He looked at history, right?
Lummis acknowledged that and talked about that connection.
Yeah.
And that's something, arguably, crazily enough, people are only now starting to like, oh, right. Like, when it's like, well, yeah, no, he was talking about that 100 years ago, but like, and it's like a duh, like you said, if you just know, if you actually learn, but it's that thing of like, oh, right, this is one place, and we just think about that. And that's very important. It comes up at the museum. Lummis wrote a book about the history of Mexico before the Second Revolution that was published, and we have a copy of it on display.
His copy?
No, not his copy. We don't have his books. His books are all in the Autry's collection. We have later editions that we just have for the purpose of being on display. And I have one on display, and I had a visitor come in once, a young guy, a teenager come in, and I had to give him an intro to the house and said, oh, this is he was a big promoter of the history and culture of the Southwest. It was very brief. And he comes in and he said, oh, he wrote a book on the history of Mexico. And And I said, yes. And he said, oh, but you said his thing was the Southwest.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, yeah, like, because this was Mexico
Yeah.
up until not that long ago in history, right? And
It's
as somebody
the
who was
arbitrary border.
right, exactly, it was somebody created a border
Right.
after that,
Yeah.
and it was, I saw in his face as a, and I'm Mexican. I was born in Mexico. I was born in Mexico City, but my family's from Sonora too, and so I feel very definitely
Yeah.
that what Lummis was trying to purport was part of my history
Yeah.
too. And I think this young guy hadn't thought of it that
Yeah,
way.
no.
And I saw it when it clicked in his eyes
Yeah.
that, like, oh right, like, you know, I'm not an immigrant
Yeah.
necessarily,
Right, not necessarily.
even though I am in the modern sense. It's like this is a
Yeah.
part of my story too and my
Yeah.
history, and I feel like that's the
Yeah,
most
that's-
impactful
there's
part
his
of
legacy.
Lummis's legacy today.
Interesting, yeah.
And very lucky when we get to that moment. We don't always
Yeah.
get there, but
Well, and that's also part of the reason his promotion of the Spanish, of course,
romanticized for sure. Yeah.
in the Americas, is why he got the award
Yeah. He was
from the
knighted.
King of Spain.
Yeah,
the,
Yeah, I
his
knew
cross, yeah,
I
the
always
order
say
of the
it
Queen
wrong. Isabella.
is the Queen
the-
Isabella, order of the Queen of Isabella. Yeah, yeah.
You know, and I think about it, as you said, because I've been thinking he got the notion for preservation from the city librarian Tessa Kelso. She started a preservation association in 1888 to preserve California missions. She actually raised close to $1,000, and that was a lot of money
Yeah,
at that time.
1984, about.
And so I've always been interested in the Landmarks Club. And I've been trying to figure out, because I'd like to write something on it, and how, because it's sensitive issues in California with Native
Very
peoples.
topical right now.
The colonial settler narrative, or the settler colonial narrative, and I don't want to offend my California Native friends, but I think, and I've been looking at and reading a lot of articles on preservation, the history of preservation in the United States, when it happened, why it happened. And I know it's still a hurtful subject. It's going to be across the United States to all Native peoples. But it's acknowledging, preservation is acknowledging your culture and history and heritage of a place. So I've been trying to, I don't want to glorify the missions, but I want to acknowledge why Lummis, and well, even Tessa, why they felt it was important. Because it's like almost 100 years, well, less than 100 years after the founding of many of the missions in California. They're in disrepair because once they've been secularized.
Yeah, after the first Mexican
After the
Revolution.
first
Yeah.
Mexican Revolution, not many of those missions
Right, they weren't used.
were
they were just
used.
left to
Yeah.
be
they were
abandoned,
left
yeah. Right,
to deteriorate.
right.
So and I think that's another. I was telling Kristen, I was looking at the California State. I'm getting this backwards. Parks and Recs and Park government website on California preservation, and they acknowledge. They don't say too much about Tessa, but they acknowledge Lummis and the Landmarks
Right,
Club
sort of the beginning of preservation.
as the beginning of preservation in California. So now I'm trying to figure out how
Yeah,
how to do that. But I think, that's his lasting legacy.
absolutely, yeah. He's a huge impact on historiography in the Southwest.
Yeah.
For good and bad. Again, some of it is a lot of it we look at critically now,
Right.
and are trying to undo
Right.
again the romantic ideas of the missions and things like that. But it's still there nevertheless, and it's
Yeah.
still like
Yeah.
and these are the oldest colonial sites of California. They're places that should be preserved. maybe the way they
The
presented them or thought about it was
the
misguided.
interpretation
Right.
needs to be changed
But-
today.
but-
and
but-
they acknowledge that.
Yeah,
in
but
all
it's
the
still an
mission.
important history, that history of preservation, right?
Yeah.
Again, in a place that we don't think, or that other people might not think of as rich in preservation. In fact, we do have this rich preservation
Super
history,
rich, yeah.
and that's part of why I
Yeah.
interpret there.
I'm
too.
from New Mexico, so that's we
Yeah.
think about it a lot.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's all
Well,
around us.
And
Absolutely.
And
we
Arizona.
were
Yeah.
talking about Isleta Pueblo.
Yeah.
and
Oh my gosh, yes.
Lummis and all his time there, and my greatest joy that I had working in the Bronx was working with the cultural committee from Isleta. They would always come, and they would go visit El
We
Alisal
still get visitors from
because
Isleta Pueblo to this day.
because
I believe that.
people from Lummis brought some of the younger people from Isleta to help him build a house. They lived at the house, so it was. And Lummis had gathered some objects, and they were on display at one time in the Southwest Hall of the Southwest Museum. The elders would always go, and I would say, visit them. And I would leave them alone, and they would speak in Tiwa.
Yep.
And I never asked what they were talking,
Right.
and they would visit.
Yeah.
And then the young people that were came to El Alisal, Lummis recorded them.
Yeah.
People always thought he recorded them at his letter, but he always did it at El Alisal on wax cylinders. And we, throughout many years of the concept of preservation, the museum transferred them to wire recordings. They transferred those to aluminum discs, and they transferred them to reel and cassettes and so on, and to digital. And I always loved when the elders would come and look. And then they would come and look at the photographs. Lummis had hundreds of photographs of Isleta. And they would look at the correspondence and all that,
Yeah.
but
And Dixon has a legacy there as well.
yeah.
I mean, if you saw in the museum, there's one nice
Yes.
thing
Yeah.
of
I did see that.
Isleta.
Isleta.
I saw
And I
that.
have
Yeah.
a friend who,
Yeah.
she's Isleta. She's full-blooded Isleta.
Yeah.
And we're trying to identify that person.
Oh, that
and
exact spot.
and that person. There's a
Yeah.
person there
There's a
too.
person? Oh, I didn't
Yeah.
see. I have
Yeah.
to look at it
And
more closely.
they still
She thinks she knows who it is.
acknowledge.
It could be, yeah.
They still acknowledge the casita or room block that Lummis
Yeah,
lived
that Lummis
in
lived
at,
in there.
at,
Yeah.
at,
They started
at
well.
Isleta.
Yeah, it's an interesting. So that's just yet another example
Yeah.
of the sort of
The kind of legacy.
the national legacy
Yeah.
that Lummis has to this
Yeah,
day.
and
right?
Dixon
Beyond
wouldn't
just
have,
Los
he wouldn't
Angeles
have
and
gone there
California.
without Lummis's
Yeah.
guidance. I mean, that's why he
Yeah.
went there in 1900
I'm sure.
and 1902 as well.
I'm sure
Yeah.
he
You know.
felt compelled because of
Oh,
course,
he
he had a
did.
deep
Yeah.
connection to
Yeah,
Isleta, having lived
Yeah,
there.
when he runs out of money on his trip in 1900, Lummis sends him money and then comes and visits him.
And probably a good word ahead.
And yeah,
Yeah.
oh yeah, for sure, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, who is this? Because they're, a very conservative,
Mm-hmm.
group, and they, rightly so. They don't want people in there
Yeah.
unless they feel
Yeah.
like they should be in there.
Right.
Right.
Lummis somehow, at least at some part of it,
Talked his
felt
way
that
in.
way.
Yeah.
At least at one part
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
There's another part that wasn't.
Yeah.
But so, do you think that you have a grip on who this man was, Kim? I mean, you're archivist.
I used to think so. It's been a while since I've thought about him, and I've been, rethinking about him because I have a friend who's a writer here in Tucson, and we now make every Friday afternoon, we go to the public library, to their study room, and she writes what she writes, and I write and think and do more research about what I want to do with the Landmarks Cup, because I've thought about it for a long time, and I'm especially Lummis did, this is an aside to Lummis, but in 1916 they had a conference in Riverside
At the Mission Inn?
at the Mission Inn on Landmarks Club, and they had representatives from the State Department of Education of California. And one of the aspects that those people were assigned to do, they were to go back and look at how mission history was taught. And I don't no longer know the archivist in the state archives. But I'd like to find out exactly when mission history was begun
In the statewide
teaching,
curriculum.
To be
teaching,
appreciated.
Right.
Yeah,
to
so
be
yes.
appreciated.
Or integrated into the actual
integrated
statewide
into
curriculum.
the statewide curriculum.
Yeah.
Was it before that? Was it as a result
Of this
Lummis.
of this
1916.
1916 conference?
Uh-huh.
So this is one of it's been it's been on my mind for many years.
So it's still affecting you there for sure.
It
in
is.
some tangent way. Do you think you have a sense of who he was?
In a broad way.
Yeah.
But like, I don't think there's always still things. There's still surprises.
Yeah.
Where like, and you're like, you're
Yeah.
incidentally. I often stew on. My thing with Lummis that I often stew on is like, it's a chicken or the egg argument. Are we interested in this person because he left this incredible? You know what I mean? Like, there's so much to parse through, and there's so
Right.
much information. And again, it's all. With the foresight that people, or is that created, right? Like,
Right.
which is it? Like, are we interested because there is this wealth of things to look through? I again, I don't claim to be the expert at Charles Lummis, but
Is anyone?
I think it would be impossible to. That's a good
Yeah.
point. That's a good point,
You
right?
can
Because
only
it's like,
really know one
and it shifts.
part
Again,
of
he's a
Lummis.
human, and that's the other thing too. It changes
Yeah.
over time, like everybody else. But the difference is that he left this record of all of this
Yeah.
change. So if you were to myopically look at one part of his life, you would be like, "Oh, this is this guy."
Yeah.
But it evolves.
And-
So, in my understanding of him over years has evolved, and it's again, like a lot of the things I mentioned have been because of years of stewing on this stuff.
Right. No,
You know,
I mean, that's
they're
what
like,
this guy
"Oh,
is."
that's what this guy." Oh, I see. You know, again, like his relationship with women writers,
Right.
his all of this, you know, the sort of artifice to his creation, all of that stuff. So yeah, I don't know
Well, and
that you could,
I was
ever
gonna
really
say
know
when
him.
we were indexing the correspondence and we had like 16 volunteers reading everything, and many of them were older women, and they were always mad at him because of his attitudes about women. And I'd say to them, you need to remember he's a Victorian man, and this is where his attitudes are.
Yeah.
You can't apply, well, you can.
You can certainly, you certainly could.
This would have been late
Yes.
20th century
Yeah.
philosophy,
Yeah.
and he was.
Yeah. No, he was definitely a man of his
he was
time,
a
and a
and
man
many-
ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
Some ways he was a chauvinist, other ways he was
A champion for
a
all these female
champion.
authors
And again,
And
you were
other
asking,
artists too.
and other artists,
yeah,
right?
artists, and you were asking about his ideas in native communities and his interest in them. Well, I can't remember which group it was. Somebody from back east wanted his help in getting sponsorship, or it was something that was needed for, I don't remember which tribe, from back east, and he had no interest in it. He was only interested in the South,
In the Southwest,
not all Southwest either,
correct?
tribes,
Right.
and California natives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's where he saw his role, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, and again, within that
Yeah.
that role that he had
Yeah.
created for
Yeah.
himself.
Just tell me about the Alisal, right? The sycamore, right?
Oh yeah! Oh my gosh!
Yeah,
Yeah,
just
we
'cause-
talked about everything. We're talking about Lummis.
Kind of as we finish this up,
Right.
I'd like
Yeah,
to know
no, for
about
sure.
that. I mean, I have.
It's so funny because
this-
again, I say, oh,
Yeah.
I'm the expert. I'm not the expert at
Yeah.
Lummis. Not the expert at Alisal. No, Alisal, for just, I guess, for people who are watching this who have no context, Charles Lummis began building El Alisal after coming back to Los Angeles in he came back in the early 1990s. He lived in another home, but he had this notion that he had wanted to build his own house. I posit, this is my thing since I've been there, is that I posit, because I can't think of an earlier example, that that his house, El Alisal, is the beginning of the arts and crafts movement in Southern California. I can't think
There's
of an
been some, Dr. Winters used to say.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's good. Oh, I'm glad you said that, because I'm happy to pick up that torch.
Yeah.
Especially, I'll happily give Robert Winter his due for creating that, if that's the case.
Yeah.
But yes, it really is, because there isn't an earlier example, and it is a completely hand-built house made of stone.
Right. From the property, right?
From the edge of the property.
Yeah.
The property is along the Arroyo Seco, which is a tributary of the Los Angeles River. It's in what's now northeast Los Angeles,
Right.
Highland Park, close to the Southwest Museum. But it is a completely hand-built house that Lummis built with just the help of a few teenagers and his own children, a lot of child labor, and a lot of friends and family and whoever he can
Right.
get to harangue and to help him with the heavy lifting. But that is a completely handcrafted house of stone. Charles Lummis did almost all of the woodwork in the house himself. And it really is kind of a giant piece of folk art beyond a functional piece of architecture. And what Lummis is going for architecturally is this, it's an extension of his persona. It's this
Right.
fantasy version of a Southwestern house. It's not a faux historic house. It's not a replica of an actual 19th century
Lummis
adobe.
house.
Right.
Yeah.
It's this heightened, it's the Instagram, it's the Disneyland version of a Southwestern house.
And
right?
you have these artists like Dixon and Breen that are coming there to get married
and
under it.
And Dixon contribute to the house, like as in terms of designs for the hinges on the front doors and pyrography. There's done a couple built-in pieces that Lummis built there. So he had other artists, like I said, the mural, the Charles Walter Stetson sculpture.
And he's got poetry. Each one of his fireplaces
Above the
are different,
fireplaces,
and they have different art.
Yeah.
Did he do the poetry?
I think all the poetry there is his.
It may be his.
There's
I don't
something
know
upstairs
his
that's a
much.
biblical reference that's
Yeah.
not his. But the other two poems that are there definitely sound like Charles Lummis.
Well, and you see that little drawing in the Art Museum of the Sycamore,
Yeah.
Yes.
which is June of 1907.
Yes.
Right? Yes. No, 1900. Yeah, June of 1900.
Yeah, so that was right when he was still beginning the construction of the house.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was right at 1900. He
Yeah.
goes there and asks Lummis's opinion. He needs to know, should he go east to see the west, right? Because he's never gone.
Yes.
You know, he's
Right.
been in California, but he's never gone to Arizona or New
Or New
Mexico.
Mexico.
He went to Nevada first, didn't he?
No,
It was
1902 he went to Nevada.
Oh, okay.
so he goes to New
Yeah.
Mexico first?
He goes to Arizona,
Arizona,
and New
and New
Mexico
Mexico,
City.
okay.
Yeah, for 6 months.
Okay.
Because Lummis says, yes,
Yeah.
you should go see this.
Yeah.
You're right, you should go east to see the west.
Yeah.
And I see that little drawing of Dixon's, and I think of all the history that's going on at that moment.
Right.
You have a pandemic going on of bubonic plague in San Francisco.
right.
Yeah.
And he's escaping that, Dixon, bad lungs, asthmatic,
Yeah.
to go, this is a good time for me to get out of here. And he goes and he sees that tree, Lummis's tree,
Yes.
documents, put the dates, and that's probably where he had that conversation. It's
I'll
right
bet.
there.
But,
Absolutely.
the
So-
one that you have in the
Yeah,
museum.
and so
Yeah,
you
the
see-
timing,
beautiful.
works
yeah.
out perfectly.
It's all perfect. And you
Yeah.
see that little, that's what I love about history and art and how they combine.
Right.
You see that and you would think nothing. But that's
Right.
because if you don't know the history,
Right. It's
you
this,
can't put it
it's this
together.
Right.
important moment in
And
his
it's like a
life.
critical component of who Dixon becomes because of Lummis and that tree.
Yeah.
And again, Lummis building this house architecturally,
Right
the
there.
main rooms of the house are inspired by the pueblos of northern New Mexico.
Yeah.
There's a lot of northern New Mexico influence. Again,
Yeah.
it's that
There's a
meshing
lot
of all
of
the
things,
things
yeah.
of the
Yeah.
thing, the architectural
Well, and you have
vernacular of the
the
Southwest.
two casitas.
Right,
that
which is also
Lummis-
very inspired
which
by
is very
Pueblo culture,
Pueblo
Pueblo
culture.
architecture.
And the casitas are on,
They're
They're
just
on
across from the
Yeah.
tree from the other
Yeah.
side of the house.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were bedrooms
And-
for his older children.
Yeah, one was built for.
those are closed, I assume, to the public.
They're not open.
They're not
Unfortunately,
open.
those need to be restored
Yeah.
because they're in very rough shape. The one was built by his son Jordan, so they weren't built as substantially as the main house.
Yeah.
But really quick, the tree, because
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
viewers
please.
know the tree. The house was built around. I can give it like El Alisal was Aliso was the California's name for a California sycamore tree,
Yeah.
which is a native tree you find in riparian areas in Southern California.
Right.
Throughout
And
California, and in Arizona, yeah,
Of course, we are Southwest.
and throughout California, and they're native. And there was a giant old sycamore tree that kind of had like 4 branches, almost
Right.
like the points of the compass. That was on this property that he bought, and he built the house around it. So the tree took up this massive tree took up the whole courtyard. Fortunately, that historic tree is no longer
When
there.
did it die or go
In
away?
1955, it died in 1955.
Is there anything left of the...
No, because the tree, my understanding was that it was already a very old tree when Lummis built the house, so it either died simply of old, it was a very old tree, or it caught some disease or
Yeah.
something. And so, unfortunately, they had to cut down all of that tree and then they replanted a replacement tree in 1955 that was actually, it was written up in the newspaper. That's how famous
And is
the
that
tree was.
tree?
Unfortunately, that tree is no longer, that we have the third generation of tree there now, because
When did the other one die?
the last piece of the 1955 tree was just cut down since I've been there in the past 12 years, because it was it had caught some sort of root disease too, and is about to fall on the house.
Yeah.
Well, obviously,
Yeah. So
the house is more important than the tree.
Third,
So yeah.
And when was the third one planted?
Oh, the third one. Well, the third one was already kind of there. The tree that's there now was planted in 1985 when they completely redid the garden there at the museum. So this is the third tree now. But the house is named for that giant tree that was there, which he nicknamed El Alcalde Mayor, because he would. Lummis had an excuse to have a party, but like he would give people subpoenas. He'd give people have people served to come to a party, and they had to answer to that. He'd had to answer to the Alcalde Mayor. We have on display one of the copies of this. I can't imagine getting served like a party invitation. How irritating that would be, because they looked real. Like if you looked and you're like, oh my God, what is this? And you're accused of not having a good old California time, and you had to answer to the tree. The tree was the judge.
You had to answer to the tree.
Mm-hmm. So the tree was very important to Lummis.
Which is Lummis.
Yes.
The tree is
Lummis. Right.
When you think about it.
Yeah.
He built the house around the tree.
Around the tree, yeah.
He feels the tree.
And the tree is still basically in the same
more or less
area.
The replacement tree is a little off from where the historic tree was.
And you think about Dixon in his later life, cottonwoods were his.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, his totem of himself. Being alone in the desert, surviving when other things may not.
Right. Tree as allegory. Yeah. That's an interesting.
As it was for Lummis, I think.
Absolutely.
Be, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Again, the whole house and the whole place is just an extension of his persona.
Yeah. There we go. I think that's a good way to end it. Unless you have something else to say.
No,
I think we kind of covered
that's good.
Lummis.
Oh, we can go for hours, but yeah.
We may have. I don't know. But,
we might run out of digital tape.
But yeah, very interesting. Yeah, Lummis is an interesting guy. Well, I will make sure I come out and see it.
Yes.
And is there a website for the house?
The city has a website. So the City Department of Recreation and Parks website. So if you Google Lummis Home El Alisal, it'll be the top result. But so it's not a.
Is there a
it's not
Facebook
a
or
website.
Instagram account?
Not yet, but there'll be one forthcoming this year. And part of it is we're starting to step things up right now. The City of Los Angeles, the Department of Recreation and Parks, has been kind of running it minimally for the past few years. There's a long story that's not interesting about why that is, but now we're starting to step things up, and so we're looking to start doing programming this year. We might expand hours, but all of that will be. It's all pretty easily Googleable, so definitely.
Are you still participating in the Museums of the World?
We do every year. We do a big event with the Pasadena Museum of History, the Gamble House, the Police Museum, and the Heritage Square. A few other local museums in that area along the Arroyo Seco and in Los Angeles and Pasadena every year, where it's an open house. That's always this year. It'll be May 4th.
It's earlier because it used to be.
We pushed it to earlier.
And it's like
used to be on the International
It's like an open house
Museum
day, and all of the days. You're right, exactly. We made it earlier. Yeah. The other thing I would tell people to check out too, Kim and I both appear in it. KCET, which is the public television station in Los Angeles, they do a series called Artbound.
Yes, I
and
know
they
that.
did a whole hour-long documentary on Charles Lummis.
I watched that.
Yeah,
it was terrific.
6-7 years ago, something like
that's
that.
about right.
Yeah,
7 or 8,
and Kim and I are both in it. But yeah, you can check that out on YouTube. So if you just search Charles Lummis on YouTube, it'll be one of the top results.
Very good, and they can see. Yeah, I watched that film actually. That was
and
very
another
good.
thing, the Maxwell Museum. I don't know if I'm sure. Yeah, you know about this. The Maxwell Museum of Anthropology, which is the anthropological museum in the University of New Mexico.
Yes.
They did during COVID. People were doing online exhibits. It's a YouTube video about their collection of Lummis cyanotypes, because we were talking about Lummis cyanotypes earlier. That's also on YouTube, and they did a good job
Very
of that
interesting.
too. Yeah, it's worth checking out.
Recently, one of my friends reposted on Facebook because I did a presentation on the Lummis Wax Cylinder recording.
Yeah.
It was an online exhibit.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It's back up again on the
Autry's
website if you want to see.
She wrote a great article about his sound recordings
about
that he
his
did
sound
at El Alisal.
recordings, and it didn't.
I wonder if that was related to Curtis doing it, since he knew Curtis, because Curtis was doing those
he did it before Curtis. He started it.
When he got that money from archaeology, it was before the museum.
It was before the museum because
okay.
he was collecting what he was calling the archaeological kind of present because he wanted to preserve
Oral history.
Well,
Spanish.
Like what we're
music, yeah.
doing
Yeah.
right now.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
But
he
with
knew
what?
Alice Fletcher, and
Yeah.
he knew Natalie Curtis, and went right out of my head. The other woman that did recordings in the Southwest, I'll think.
Yeah. But a lot of all of those recordings, those Edison wax cylinders, have subsequent, like Kim was
They've
saying
been
earlier, about how they've been
digitized.
preserved in
Yeah.
many different ways over the years. But they've all been digitized. Big chunk of them are available on the Internet Archive. The Autry has uploaded them. You
I-
can
yeah.
search, assuming the Internet Archive is working, because
That's
lately they've had a few issues, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
presumably they'll be working. So if you search Charles Lummis on the Internet Archive, you can
Yeah.
listen to a
Yeah.
big chunk of those Edison wax cylinder recordings.
He still has his
There's
finger.
a-
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
everywhere.
There's a group, Los Californios,
Yes, in
out
San
of
Diego.
San Diego, that perform many of the
The folk songs that were
folk
recorded in
songs,
those
Spanish
wax
folk
cylinders.
songs.
Yeah.
And the thing that people need to realize, those wax cylinders only can play up to
times.
like 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're not getting the full song.
Yeah.
So like Los Californios, Vicky, I can't remember, Menendez Gray, transcribed, and she created the full folk song when she could find it. So when Los Californios performs it, they actually perform the whole folk song. Because I did have an issue one time with another one of the Pueblo groups Francis Densmore, who came to listen to the Francis Densmore recordings. They were upset, thinking that I wasn't providing them with the full
Oh,
song.
but it was just the
And
limitation
I
of the
had
wax
to-
cylinder.
And it's just
Yeah.
the limitation of
Yeah.
the wax cylinder. You don't get the full song.
Right.
You get a stanza or two
Yeah.
on those recordings.
So he's definitely still relevant.
Absolutely.
It is.
Absolutely.
It is.
Yeah. He's a very enigmatic person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, lots to
and
pick
Los
apart.
Yeah, there is.
Californios.
Yeah.
Los Californios always give him credit
Oh, yeah.
when they perform.
No, they're great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, thank you for.
Thank you.
I know I
Thank you.
just kind of
Yeah.
hijacked
Yeah.
your whole
Impromptu.
afternoon.
Yeah.
That's all
You
right.
know, and mine, but
Yeah.
it's fascinating for
You
me.
made it that much more interesting. We
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Well, yeah, he's just he's so important in Dixon life and
Yeah.
who that guy is. I mean, I have a sense of who he is,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Well, when you come by Alisal, definitely check. I want to
Oh,
hear
yeah.
more about that
Yeah.
that relationship for sure, because you've
I'll
really
probably learn more by then
Did you
too.
ever, in your readings, did Lummis ever say anything about the Dixon's divorce?
No, well,
Because
he
they
did-
both wrote things
Yeah.
in the house book, so they both seemed very close to him.
Yeah, so he gets divorced in 17.
Yeah.
He writes Lummis in 18 that he can't go on as an artist.
Right.
And it's implied that this is partially because of this.
Yeah.
And, he writes Lummis about women troubles as well that he has. I'm trying to think when that was. It was with his first wife at some point too, and he talks about that's Constance, his
Yeah.
first wife that we're talking about because he has 3,
Yeah.
right? And he doesn't divorce Dorothea Lange until 35.
Okay.
They get married in March of 20.
Yeah.
So she would have known Lummis.
Yeah.
I would have loved to see what her thoughts were on Lummis.
Oh,
And
Yeah.
I have not,
that would be good.
and I have not seen that.
Interesting.
No.
But I mean, he's there at the funeral, and supposedly she would have been at the funeral as well at that
Yeah.
same time in 28. So I mean, that's very possible. That's when Dan was born. So who knows? But I haven't seen any writings on that. But I'm sure, she had her own opinions. Did he know Ansel Adams? Because
I don't
I
think
don't
so.
think
There's
so.
no evidence
There's
that
no
he
evidence. Yeah.
Dorothea and Dixon were good friends with Ansel Adams.
did. Correct, right?
And
But
he-
I think that's that San Francisco connection, right? Was Ansel Adams ever lived in Southern California?
So he knew him. I think, I don't know for a fact, but I think that was probably correct.
Okay.
The San Francisco component, but I don't know exactly when they were been friends for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, she was friends with early photographers in 19. I mean, she's when she gets married. She's
Yeah.
a young girl.
Yeah.
She had been a photographer already. She was already doing it. She goes to America, or from Hoboken to L.A. first in 1919, I think, is when she comes. She's born in 1895.
Okay.
She's only 24.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So.
It's interesting, too, because a lot of these people are a lot younger than Lummis, too, so I think there's a generational thing.
He was. That's why Dixon looks at him as father, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I think with a lot of the later photographers, I think there is there's a bit of a gap there where Lummis he was a big networker, but, I think at some point there's enough of a generation gap that you don't really
Dixon
do
would
as
have
well.
talked a lot about Lummis to his wife.
Oh, sure,
To
of course.
Dorothea,
Yeah.
right? And would have had to go through the trauma of him going to his burial.
Right.
Right. And Dixon was a very sensitive guy. And there would have been, and again, he would have looked at it as his father, whether he wanted to or not, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And, there would have been a lot of angst for him going to do that with, and be a pallbearer.
Yeah.
So she would have had a good sense of the man,
Absolutely.
the whole good, bad, and indifferent.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So it'd be interesting. I have never seen anything written about that.
Yeah.
I would love to have that conversation with Dorothea.
That's Lummis, and that triad and all of that, the Dixon and Lummis world is a whole book in itself.
Yeah. And it is. And Lummis, he was impressed with Dixon. I mean, he was an important guy, right? Dixon was well known. He was well enough known in Lummis's mind to be important.
Of course.
Right.
And I think he also recognized he was a great genius in painting and drawing and writing and poetry and all that, and Lummis does poetry, Dixon does poetry, they're a kindred spirit there.
Yeah.
But asking Dixon to contribute to Alisal is just a testament to that.
Yeah. And
Because
Dixon,
he didn't do that with every single artist.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Dixon
That he knew.
gives paintings to the museum as well, his own paintings.
Yeah.
Some of which came back after they were gone and came back.
Right. Oh,
Yeah.
right.
Another story.
That's another story. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll leave it on that. And another.
Yeah,
show.
that's
There's
another.
always
That's for another
story
time.
on this podcast. So. All right. Thank you both.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kim, both of you.
You're welcome.
And we'll let you get back to your. It sounds like you've got a dinner you have.
I
to
know.
do.
I was gonna say.
husband.
You serve
You got
your
a
plans.
full day.
Yeah.
of Lummis that you probably were not
More than you
expecting.
thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you're
It is.
thoroughly.
I told him I was going to be
Was that
here.
good? I hope that wasn't too long.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
We were
when
long.
Pat asked, how long does it go?
Yeah.
The answer is, as long as it must.
As long as it
Yeah.
must.
So
Good,
that
yeah.
was-
Then you can
No,
edit
and I've
it
seen
to
the
what
ones
you
you've done
want.
before. You don't do too much editing, so
No.
do you? Yeah.
No editing.
So no editing. Okay. Yeah.
We were fine. We were
Okay.
fine.
Good.